I'm 33 years old, and 3 weeks ago I became the winner of the largest jackpot in Ohio history for $112 million. And I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not pop a bottle of anything. I locked myself inside my Cedar Ridge townhouse with the blinds shut tight and refreshed the Ohio State Lottery website over and over again as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less life-altering. I sat at my small kitchen table with the ticket laid flat in front of me like evidence in a trial, comparing each number slowly, methodically, whispering them under my breath, feeling not excitement, but a tightening in my chest that felt like someone had replaced oxygen with cold metal. Every time the numbers aligned exactly the same way, the reality pressed harder against my skull, and instead of joy, I felt watched, exposed, vulnerable. Money has never meant safety to me. In my house growing up, money meant leverage. It meant control. It meant whoever held it got to decide who was worthy and who was not. My mother, Diane Caldwell, treated wealth like a moral ranking system. She measured love in gifts and used generosity as a leash. If she bought you something expensive, she reminded you of it whenever you stepped out of line. If she paid for something, she owned your gratitude permanently. My older brother, Travis Caldwell, absorbed that lesson early and turned it into competition. Every report card was a battlefield. Every promotion a silent war. Every small success of mine treated like an act of aggression against him. When I got into a decent college, he called it luck. When I landed my first stable job, he said it was timing. Nothing I achieved was ever allowed to exist without being diminished. The only person who never made me feel like I had to earn oxygen was my younger sister, Megan Caldwell. Megan is 26 now, and even when she was a kid, she had this quiet steadiness about her, like she didn't need to compete to feel secure. When Mom compared us at the dinner table, Megan would change the subject. When Travis made passive-aggressive jokes about my grades or my salary, she would roll her eyes at him behind his back. She was the only one who treated me like a person instead of a rival or an investment. So when I realized that the numbers on that ticket had just changed my life, my first instinct was not to celebrate with family, but to protect myself from them. I had seen what money did in our house when there was barely any of it. I could only imagine what $412 million would turn it into. I contacted an attorney the next morning, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Richard Lawson who specialized in high-net-worth asset protection, and I told him I wanted to claim the prize anonymously. I remember sitting in his office, hands clasped so tightly they were shaking, while he explained the trust structures and the confidentiality agreements in a calm, professional tone. I signed everything without hesitation. My name would not appear in headlines. My face would not be on billboards. Officially, the winner would be a legal entity, not Ethan Caldwell from Cedar Ridge. But even with the legal shield in place, my mind did not settle. I kept imagining my mother finding out somehow, imagining Travis calculating what he thought he deserved, imagining family dinners turning into negotiations disguised as concern. I realized that if they ever discovered the truth, I would never know whether their reactions were real or influenced by the weight of the number attached to my name. And that realization burrowed into me deeper than any fear of strangers. I decided to do something that, even as I planned, it felt twisted, but I justified it as necessary. I would test them, not with cruelty, not with dramatic accusations, but with absence. Instead of announcing success, I would imply struggle. I would step back from the small financial stability they believed I had and see who leaned in and who leaned away. I would create a version of myself that appeared to be failing and watch their responses closely. I told myself that if money in our family equaled love, then the removal of perceived money would reveal the truth of what was left. That night, I sat alone in my living room, lights off except for the glow of my laptop, looking at my bank account that was about to be eclipsed by something unimaginable, and I felt smaller than I ever had. The wind felt like a spotlight aimed at my back, even though no one else knew. I imagined the headline in my mind, and then erased it because it would never exist publicly. I thought about calling Megan, just Megan, telling her everything and trusting her the way she had always trusted me. But I stopped myself. If I told her, it would alter the experiment. Even her pure loyalty would become tangled with knowledge of the money, and I needed to know what existed without that influence. I have spent my entire life navigating a household where affection was transactional and success was weaponized, and now I hold more power than anyone in my family has ever touched, and instead of feeling triumphant, I feel like I'm standing on thin ice, aware that one wrong step could crack open everything I've tried to build separately from them. $412 million sits behind legal documents and confidentiality clauses, and I sit in a quiet townhouse in Cedar Ridge, blinds closed, phone face down on the table, preparing to see who in my life values me when I appear to have nothing at all. I waited 2 days after setting up the anonymous claim before I began what I convinced myself was a necessary experiment. And I chose a Tuesday afternoon because I knew my mother would be home, and because something about the ordinary rhythm of a weekday made the lie feel more believable. And when she answered the phone, I forced a tremor into my voice that I did not have to fake very hard since my chest was already tight from the weight of what I was doing. I told her that the small tech startup I had been contracting with had collapsed without warning, that funding had dried up, that payroll had frozen, and that I had been let go with no severance. And I layered the story carefully, mentioning overdue rent and a landlord who had posted a notice on my door, building the picture slowly so she could absorb it piece by piece. And before I even finished explaining, she exhaled sharply into the phone like I had personally inconvenienced her afternoon. She cut me off mid-sentence and said she could not deal with another disappointment, her voice flat and irritated. And there was no pause to ask how I was holding up or whether I had a plan. There was only the subtle implication that my struggle reflected poorly on her. And then she said she had a meeting to get to, even though I could hear the television in the background. And the line went dead with a mechanical click that echoed louder in my ear than it should have. I stared at the screen after the call ended, watching the duration timer disappear, and felt something settle in a place inside me. Not shock because I had expected very little, but confirmation that my value in her eyes was still tethered to performance. I waited an hour before calling Travis, pacing my living room as I rehearsed the next part. And when he answered, he sounded distracted, annoyed that I had interrupted whatever he considered important. I told him a condensed version of the same story, and then added that I might need somewhere to stay for a week while I figured things out. And I kept my tone controlled and measured because I wanted to observe, not provoke. And for a brief second there was silence on the other end that made me think he might surprise me. But then he laughed, not a nervous laugh or an awkward one, but a sharp, genuine laugh that carried amusement. He called me pathetic in a tone that felt almost casual, like he had been waiting for evidence that I was less capable than he was. And he said he was not running a charity and that I should have planned better. And when I tried to respond, he spoke over me and said he did not have time for my drama before the call disconnected. And within minutes, I realized my number had been blocked because my next attempt went straight to voicemail. By the time I opened Megan's contact, my hands were no longer shaking, but they felt heavy, as if I already knew what this call would cost me. She answered on the second ring, her voice soft and steady the way it had always been. And I told her the same story, but this time the words felt heavier in my mouth, as if I were pressing them through resistance. When I finished explaining that I was about to be evicted and did not know what to do, there was silence on her end, not dismissive silence, but processing silence. And then she asked one simple question in a tone that carried no judgment, only focus. She asked where I was. I told her I was stranded at a cheap motel near Brookfield, about 180 miles away, adding details about the stained carpet and the flickering hallway lights to make it convincing, and I expected hesitation or advice, or at least a discussion about logistics. Instead, she said she would call me back, and the line went quiet. I stood there staring at the wall, feeling a flicker of doubt about how far I was willing to take this. And then my phone buzzed with a text from her that said she was on her way and that she was already halfway there. And I checked the timestamp and realized she must have left almost immediately after we hung up. The distance between Cedar Ridge and Brookfield is not short, especially at night, and she had not asked for proof, had not asked for reassurance, had not asked whether I deserved help. She had simply moved. She sent another message explaining she had sold her tablet to a coworker that afternoon for quick cash, and that she was using the last $600 she had to cover gas and a few nights at the motel if necessary. And as I read those words, sitting in my perfectly safe townhouse with blinds drawn and a fortune legally waiting in a trust under my control, something inside me began to feel unstable. I watched the small typing indicator appear and disappear on my screen as she updated me from the highway, describing the darkness of the road and the way her headlights cut through it, and each message tightened the pressure in my chest. For hours later, she texted that she was pulling into the motel parking lot and asked which room I was in, and that was the moment the experiment stopped feeling clinical and started feeling cruel. I drove there before she could step out her car, needing to end it before she walked into a lie made physical. And when I arrived, she was sitting behind the wheel with her phone in her hand, eyes scanning the building for a room number I had never intended to provide. When she saw my car pull up, confusion flickered across her face before relief replaced it, and I stepped out and told her the truth in the most direct way I could manage, that there was no eviction, no collapsed startup, no motel room, that I had lied. She did not scream, and she did not accuse me of being insane. She just stared at me with a stillness that felt heavier than any outburst could have, and when I tried to explain that I needed to see who would show up, that I needed to know who would stand by me if I had nothing, the words sounded hollow even to me. She listened without interrupting, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. And when I finished, she said quietly that I had made her think I was alone, and the way she said it carried more hurt than anger, as if the real betrayal was not the lie itself, but the implication that she would ever abandon me without proof to the contrary. In that parking lot under dim fluorescent lights, with trucks passing on the highway behind us, I felt something shift between us that no amount of money could repair, because my test had not revealed her loyalty. It had questioned it. And in doing so, I had taken the one person who had never treated me as a transaction and reduced her to a variable in an experiment designed by my own paranoia. The silence that settled between Megan and me after that night in the motel parking lot did not explode into arguments or dramatic ultimatums. It thinned out into something more fragile, something that felt like glass stretched too tight, and I carried the weight of it everywhere I went because I knew I had damaged the only relationship in my life that had never been built on leverage. I could see it in the way she responded to my text days later, still kind but more measured, and I understood that apologies alone would not repair what I had fractured, especially since the truth I had withheld was far bigger than the lie I had told. The money sat untouched behind legal structures and confidentiality clauses, and every time I reviewed the statements with Richard Lawson, I felt a wave of guilt that had nothing to do with the amount and everything to do with how I had weaponized scarcity to test the one person who had never treated me as expendable. Megan had always talked about nursing school as if it were both a dream and a mountain she was not sure she could climb financially. And I remembered countless evenings when she described long shifts at work followed by online classes, calculating tuition costs with a kind of quiet determination that made me feel protective long before I had the means to act on it. I could not undo what I had done in that parking lot, but I could remove one of the heaviest burdens from her path without attaching my name to it, and that thought began to take shape into something concrete. Through a shell foundation that Richard helped structure, layered behind legal entities that would not trace back to me publicly, I created the Caldwell Health Advancement Grant, a private scholarship designed to support promising nursing students from small Ohio towns, and I made sure Megan's academic profile fit the criteria precisely without appearing tailored. When the first award of $25,000 was issued in her name for the academic year, I watched the process unfold from a distance, reviewing documents late at night in my office while the rest of Cedar Ridge slept, and for the first time since the lottery win, I felt something close to relief rather than dread. Weeks later, my phone rang, and when I saw Megan's name on the screen, I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, unsure whether the call would reopen wounds or begin to close them. Her voice sounded brighter than it had in weeks, energized in a way I had not heard since before my so-called test, and she told me she had received a random private scholarship through a health advancement grant she had never applied to directly, but for which her academic advisor had apparently nominated her based on performance and need. She talked quickly, describing the letter, the official seal, the breakdown of the annual $25,000 that would cover tuition and part of her living expenses, and I could hear the cautious hope in her tone, the kind that forms when someone has been bracing for struggle and suddenly sees a clear path forward. She said it felt unreal, but in a good way, and then her voice softened, and she told me she wanted to rebuild trust between us, because whatever had happened in that motel parking lot, she did not want it to define our relationship permanently. I listened to her gratitude directed at a faceless foundation that was in reality funded by money she did not know I possessed, and the duality of it pressed against my ribs, pride tangled with secrecy, generosity intertwined with deception. At the same time, something else began to shift in my family's atmosphere, subtle at first, and then increasingly obvious. My mother started calling more often, her tone warmer than it had been in years, asking about my projects and whether work had stabilized, dropping comments about how proud she always knew she could be if I just applied myself properly. Travis unblocked my number and sent casual messages about grabbing drinks sometime, mentioning investment opportunities he had been considering and wondering aloud how I had managed to land on my feet so fast. Their renewed friendliness was not accompanied by apologies for their earlier dismissal, only by an assumption that I must have money again, as if financial stability were the only language through which reconciliation could occur. The irony did not escape me that while I was secretly channeling millions into trusts and structured accounts, the people who had turned their backs on me at the hint of failure were now orbiting closer because they sensed success. I maintained my distance, responding politely but without offering details, and I believe for a brief stretch of time that the greatest risk in my life remained contained within the boundaries of family dynamics. That illusion fractured the afternoon. I visited the storage facility where I had temporarily placed a small fireproof box containing preliminary paperwork related to my lottery claim, documents that were no longer legally essential, but that I had not yet shredded because some irrational part of me needed physical proof that the win had been real. When I arrived, the manager's expression was strained, and he informed me there had been an attempted break-in the previous night targeting several units in my corridor, including mine. The external lock had been tampered with, scratched, and bent at the edges, and although nothing appeared missing, the security system had glitched during the incident, resulting in the footage from that time frame being corrupted beyond recovery. He spoke in rehearsed reassurances about upgraded surveillance and police reports, but his eyes avoided mine when he mentioned that the digital records had been wiped clean for approximately 45 minutes, a window large enough to enter, search, and leave without documentation. I drove home with the fireproof box in the passenger seat, my mind racing through possibilities I had deliberately tried not to consider, and that evening my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown number. The message contained no greeting, no signature, just a single sentence in capital letters that felt like it carried weight beyond its simplicity. It said, "We know about the ticket." I read it once, then again, the words static and unadorned, yet heavy enough to shift the ground beneath me. The paranoia I had felt on the night of the win returned in sharper form. No longer abstract fear of potential greed, but a direct acknowledgement that someone beyond my immediate family was aware of what I had tried so carefully to conceal. In that moment, I understood that the danger surrounding $412 million was not confined to emotional manipulation or sibling rivalry. It extended into a wider, less predictable world where erased footage and anonymous messages replaced passive-aggressive comments at dinner tables. The money had transformed from a private burden into a potential beacon, and as I sat in my darkened living room with the storage box at my feet and a message glowing on my screen, I realized that whatever had begun as a test of loyalty had evolved into something far more dangerous than family greed, because someone else was watching, and they were no longer subtle about it. After the message about the ticket and the discovery of the wiped security footage at the storage facility, I stopped pretending that cautious optimism was enough and began operating as if every physical trace of my win was a liability. And the first thing I did was retrieve the original lottery ticket from the fireproof box and schedule an appointment at First National Bank of Maplewood under an alias that existed only on paper through one of the legal structures Richard Lawson had arranged. For me, I drove there early in the morning wearing a plain jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, aware of how paranoid that looked and equally aware that paranoia had already proven justified. And when I stepped into the bank lobby, I forced myself to move at a normal pace, even though every reflective surface felt like a potential witness. The safety deposit box process was clinical and quiet, signatures exchanged, identification verified under the alias, the metal drawer sliding open with a hollow metallic sound that echoed more loudly in my head than in the small private room. And when I placed the ticket inside, I felt a temporary illusion of control, as if steel walls and bank protocols could insulate me from whatever had begun circling my life. For 3 days, nothing happened, and I almost convinced myself that moving the ticket had been an overreaction, that perhaps the anonymous message had been a cruel bluff designed to rattle me without substance. And then my phone vibrated late in the afternoon while I was sitting at my desk at home reviewing foundation documents. The image that appeared on my screen was grainy and zoomed in from a distance, but it was unmistakably me stepping out of my car in front of First National Bank of Maplewood, the angle slightly elevated as if taken from across the street or from inside another vehicle. My face was partially shadowed by the brim of the cap, yet my posture, my car, the date stamp in the corner, all of it aligned perfectly with that morning visit. My stomach dropped in a way that felt physical, like the floor had tilted beneath me, and seconds later another message followed without introduction. It said she told US everything. The words hit harder than the image because they carried implication, and the only she in my world who could plausibly connect to both my personal life and any financial irregularity was Megan. My mind replayed every recent conversation with her, every moment of hesitation in her voice after the motel incident, every instance where I might have slipped and revealed more than intended, and suspicion crept in not as a loud accusation, but as a slow, corrosive thought that I hated myself for entertaining. I called her immediately, my voice tighter than I intended, And when she answered, I did not ease into the subject, but told her directly about the photo and the message claiming she had told someone everything. There was a pause on the line, and I listened carefully for signs of rehearsed denial or defensive anger. But what I heard instead was confusion layered with hurt, the kind of reaction that cannot be easily fabricated. She insisted she had no idea what I was talking about, that she had told no one about any ticket because she did not even know there was one. And when I pressed, asking if she had mentioned my visit to any bank or any unusual behavior to anyone at school or work, she grew quiet in a way that felt wounded rather than evasive. She reminded me that the last time I had doubted her loyalty, it had nearly cost us our relationship. And the steadiness in her voice when she said she would never expose me deliberately carried a weight that made my suspicion feel ugly and misplaced. By the end of the call, I believed her, not because I wanted to, but because every instinct I had developed over decades of reading family dynamics told me she was telling the truth. That realization shifted the threat from internal betrayal to external surveillance, and before I could process that fully, another notification arrived that night from the same unknown number. This time, it was a short video clip, only a few seconds long, and when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat because the footage showed Megan sitting in her car in what looked like a grocery store parking lot, scrolling on her phone, completely unaware that she was being recorded from a distance. The camera angle suggested someone parked a few rows away, zoomed in through a windshield, the image slightly shaky but clear enough to confirm it was her. Across the bottom of the video, in stark white letters, was a single word followed by a countdown implication that made my pulse spike. It read 48 hours. The message was clear without elaboration, and every protective instinct I had suppressed in favor of calculated secrecy surged forward at once. I called her again immediately, my voice stripped of any pretense of calm, and told her to leave wherever she was and go somewhere public, somewhere crowded. But she answered from her apartment and said she had been home for hours, confused by my urgency and unaware that a video of her from earlier that day had just been sent to me as leverage. I drove to her place that night and insisted on checking the parking lot, scanning for unfamiliar vehicles, memorizing license plates without knowing which ones mattered, and she tried to reassure me that maybe it was a prank or some elaborate scam, but the precision of the surveillance felt too deliberate to dismiss. The following day, her text became strangely clipped, lacking the natural rhythm and punctuation she always used, messages that read like automated responses rather than her voice. When I called, it went straight to voicemail, and the text replies that followed were flat and mechanical. No emojis, no commas, no capitalization pattern she had always maintained almost obsessively. The words looked like someone had studied her typical responses and stripped them of personality, leaving only function. I drove to her apartment and found her car gone, her blinds half drawn, no sign of forced entry, but no sign of her either. And when I called again, the robotic messages continued, each one reinforcing the sense that the person holding her phone was not the person typing the thoughts. The 48-hour caption echoed in my head as time moved forward with cruel indifference, and I realized with a clarity that felt almost clinical that whatever entity had been watching me, photographing me at the bank, wiping security footage, and sending escalating threats had moved beyond intimidation into something tangible and personal. The money that I had tried to contain through aliases and legal structures had spilled into the real world in a way I could no longer manage quietly, and the possibility that Megan was being used as leverage because of my decision to keep a secret far larger than she ever consented to be part of settled over me like a weight that pressed against my lungs. I stood in her empty apartment with my phone in my hand, staring at another punctuation-less reply that did not sound like her, and understood that the danger I had feared in theory had materialized into something immediate, something that had crossed from surveillance into disappearance, and it was no longer abstract. The instructions arrived just before midnight, a single message from the same untraceable number that had been orbiting my life for days, and this time there was no ambiguity or psychological countdown, only a location and a directive that felt like a final move in a game I no longer believed I was playing voluntarily. I was told to bring the original ticket to an abandoned church outside Millbrook, and to come alone if I wanted Megan alive, and beneath the address was a photo taken from a distance of her sitting in that same chair I'd seen in the earlier video, her head tilted slightly downward, her hands bound behind her back, a strip of silver tape visible around her wrists. The sight of that image burned away any remaining illusion that this could be handled through lawyers or quiet negotiations, and I felt a clarity settle over me that was sharper than panic, a cold, focused determination that replaced it. I went to the safety deposit box at First National Bank of Maplewood early the next morning and retrieved the ticket with hands that were steady despite everything, because by then fear had condensed into something controlled. I had already prepared a duplicate envelope the night before, identical in weight and texture, containing a carefully folded stack of blank paper cut to match the dimensions of the original ticket, and embedded within the seam was a micro tracker small enough to evade casual inspection, but strong enough to transmit location data continuously once activated. I placed the real ticket in a separate waterproof sleeve inside my jacket, secured close to my body, and slid the fake envelope into a plain manila folder that matched the one shown in the instruction photo. The drive to the abandoned church outside Millbrook felt unreal, the rural road stretching out in long, empty segments bordered by leafless trees and cracked fencing, the sky a dull, overcast gray that flattened the landscape into something lifeless. The church itself stood isolated at the end of a gravel path, its wooden siding faded and peeling, windows boarded from the inside, the steeple leaning slightly as if tired of holding itself upright. I parked at a distance as instructed and stepped out slowly, scanning the perimeter without turning my head too sharply, aware that someone was watching even if I could not see them. The gravel crunched under my shoes in a way that sounded too loud in the silence, and when the front door creaked open before I reached it, I felt my pulse spike despite my efforts to stay composed. Travis stepped out into the doorway, and for a moment my brain struggled to reconcile the image in front of me with the scenario I had constructed in my head. He looked different, thinner somehow, his usual casual arrogance replaced by strained alertness. And when our eyes met, there was no surprise in his expression, only calculation. He told me to come inside and to leave the folder visible in my hand, and I did exactly that because at that point Megan's safety outweighed every other variable. The interior of the church smelled of dust and damp wood, pews stacked unevenly along one wall, the altar stripped of anything decorative, and Travis stood near the center aisle, as if this had become a twisted negotiation table. He admitted quickly, almost too quickly, that he had been paid to track me, that someone had approached him weeks ago with proof I had come into significant money and offered him more than he had ever seen in exchange for routine updates about my movements, my behavior, any unusual financial patterns. He said it with a mix of defensiveness and justification, as if the betrayal were a business arrangement rather than a personal decision, and he insisted he had not known it would escalate to kidnapping until it was too late to back out. He demanded the real ticket in exchange for Megan's location, his tone urgent but edged with greed, and I could see in his eyes that whatever guilt he felt was secondary to the promise of a payout that dwarfed anything he had ever earned honestly. I handed him the manila folder without argument, watching carefully as he opened it and glanced at the contents, not scrutinizing the paper closely enough to detect the deception because his focus was not on authenticity, but on possession. He nodded once and stepped back, pulling out his phone to send a message that I assumed confirmed the exchange had been completed, and within minutes my own phone vibrated with a new set of coordinates. He told me that was where Megan was being held, and that once the ticket was verified, she would be released, and although every instinct told me he was still a pawn rather than the architect, I left without pressing further because the tracker embedded in that envelope was already transmitting. The coordinates led to an industrial warehouse on the outskirts of a commercial district that had long since fallen into partial abandonment. The building large and windowed only near the roofline, its metal siding streaked with rust and graffiti. I parked several blocks away and approached on foot, tracking the signal's movement on my phone until it stabilized inside the structure, and when I found a side door unsecured, I slipped in quietly, the interior echoing with the hollow acoustics of a space built for machinery rather than secrecy. The air smelled of oil and old concrete, and my footsteps reverberated despite my efforts to move lightly. But then I saw her near the center of the warehouse floor, tied to a metal chair exactly as in the photos, her head lifting at the sound of movement. Megan's eyes widened when she saw me, relief flooding her expression in a way that made my chest tighten painfully, and I rushed forward to untie her wrists, the rope rough and biting in her skin, the tape adhesive leaving red marks where it had pressed too long. She was alive, shaken but conscious, and as I pulled the last knot free and helped her stand, a voice spoke from behind me with a calmness that did not belong in that cavernous, abandoned space. The tone was measured, almost conversational, and when I turned slowly, I saw Richard Lawson stepping out from behind a row of stacked pallets, a handgun held steadily in his right hand, his suit jacket immaculate despite the dust around him. He did not look frantic or triumphant, only composed, as if this were another controlled disclosure in his office rather than a confrontation in a warehouse. He explained with unsettling clarity that the lottery system had been manipulated for years through a network of shell charities and anonymous claims, that certain winners were guided into structured anonymity not purely for privacy, but to funnel portions of their winnings through predetermined philanthropic pipelines that functioned as laundering channels. He said my insistence on independent structures, my refusal to follow suggested allocation patterns, had disrupted a system that relied on predictable compliance, and that once I deviated, attention had shifted toward containment. Travis, he said, had been useful bait, a predictable vulnerability in my life that could be leveraged to monitor and pressure me without exposing the broader network prematurely. The fake envelope with the tracker had led me exactly where they intended, because they had anticipated I would attempt something clever, and the calmness with which he outlined the manipulation made the entire chain of events feel orchestrated rather than reactive. I stood there with Megan unsteady beside me, the real ticket still pressed against my chest inside my jacket, and understood that the threat I had tried to manage through secrecy and legal shields had never been random criminals or opportunistic greed alone. It had been embedded in the very structure I trusted to protect me. Richard Lawson's expression did not change as he shifted the gun slightly in his grip and told me that this was no longer about persuasion or negotiation, but about compliance. And he explained in the same even tone he used in conference rooms that I would authorize a full transfer of the trust funds into a revised structure he controlled, a structure that would correct my earlier deviation and restore the laundering pipeline I had unknowingly threatened. He spoke about percentages and routing accounts as if Megan were not standing beside me, with rope marks still fresh on her wrists, as if the gun in his hand were merely a punctuation mark in a contract rather than a tool capable of ending both of our lives. Then he reached into his pocket with his free hand and produced a small digital timer, setting it down on a nearby crate and pressing a button so that red numbers began counting down from 10 minutes. And he told me that if the transfer authorization was not initiated before it reached 0, accelerants already placed around the warehouse would ensure there would be nothing left of the building except ash and twisted steel. The air suddenly felt thinner, saturated with the faint chemical scent I had mistaken earlier for old industrial residue, and I understood that he had prepared this space not only as a meeting point, but as a contingency plan designed to erase evidence, and possibly us along with it. Megan's fingers tightened around my sleeve, and I could feel the tremor she was fighting to control. Yet Lawson's composure never wavered as he instructed me to call the bank liaison and begin the authorization process immediately on speaker. I forced my breathing to slow because panic would narrow my options, and instead I looked at him and told him that the transfer required verification tied directly to the original physical ticket, that the system was structured so that I could not initiate a full liquidation without the serial authentication code printed on it. I let my voice carry a note of reluctant cooperation and added that the ticket was in my car, not on me, and that I had been cautious enough not to walk into an armed confrontation carrying the one thing he actually wanted. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his face, subtle but real, and he gestured with the gun toward the warehouse doors, instructing me to retrieve it while Megan stayed where she was as collateral. I nodded and began walking slowly toward the exit, feeling the timer's red glow against my back like heat, aware that every step needed to look controlled rather than desperate. As I reached the large metal door, I wrapped my hand around the handle and pulled it open just enough to step through. Then in a single motion, I pivoted and slammed the heavy door backward with all the force I could muster, driving the edge of it into Lawson before he could fully adjust his stance. The impact knocked him off balance, and the gun discharged with a deafening crack that echoed through the warehouse, the bullet ricocheting off metal somewhere above us. Chaos replaced composure in an instant, the timer still counting down on the crate as Lawson stumbled and Megan lunged forward on instinct rather than strategy. I heard her shout my name, and when I turned back inside, she had grabbed at Lawson's arm while he was trying to regain control of the weapon, both of them struggling in a tangle of movement and dust. I rushed toward them and collided with him again, forcing his wrist downward as another shot fired into the concrete floor, sending shards upward in a spray that stung my face. The gun slipped from his grip for a fraction of a second, and Megan seized it with both hands, stepping back with it pointed shakily in his direction, her arms extended but untrained. In the distance, faint at first but unmistakable, I heard the rising wail of sirens approaching from multiple directions, and that sound cut through the warehouse like a blade. Earlier, before I had even entered the building, I had activated a delayed emergency ping on my smartwatch, a feature I had set up after the first anonymous threat, programmed to trigger a silent alert with my location if I did not cancel it within a specific time frame. I had calculated the window carefully, long enough to attempt a rescue, but short enough to ensure intervention if things escalated beyond control. Lawson heard the sirens too, and whatever composure he had regained fractured under the realization that containment was slipping away. He did not attempt to retrieve the timer or the fallen gun. Instead, he moved with startling speed toward a side exit I had not noticed earlier, disappearing through a partially concealed door that led out the back of the warehouse toward a stretch of overgrown land and dense trees. I took a step to pursue him, but stopped when Megan's voice, steadier now but urgent, cut through the noise, and I chose her over revenge without hesitation. Within moments, patrol cars skidded into the lot, officers flooding the building with weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed against the high ceiling. They secured the space, disarmed Megan carefully, and separated us for questioning while firefighters located and neutralized containers of accelerant placed along the perimeter walls. Travis was nowhere to be found, and Lawson had vanished into the woods behind the warehouse before a perimeter could be fully established. Over the next hours, I repeated the sequence of events to detectives whose expressions shifted between skepticism and concern, and I handed over the timer, the rope, the shell, casing fragments, everything tangible that might anchor the story in evidence. Yet when I returned 2 days later at their request to review the scene after forensic processing, the warehouse felt strangely sanitized, as if someone had reached it before the investigation fully solidified. Surveillance cameras in the surrounding industrial park had malfunctioned during the relevant window, nearby businesses reported corrupted digital logs, and pieces of physical evidence that should have been cataloged were described to me as inconclusive or contaminated. It felt as though an invisible hand had moved quickly and efficiently to blur the edges of what had happened, to reduce it from attempted coercion and arson to something less traceable. And the official tone of the investigation shifted subtly toward uncertainty rather than urgency. Megan stayed with me during those days, silent at times, processing trauma in her own way, and I tried to balance reassurance with the knowledge that the system we had trusted to protect us had already proven compromised. On the second evening after the warehouse incident, a plain envelope arrived at my townhouse with no return address and standard postage. The paper ordinary enough to avoid suspicion until I opened it. Inside was a single sheet with 3 words printed in clean, unembellished font that carried more weight than the timer's countdown ever had. It said, "You still owe US." Beneath the page was a photograph, recent and sharply focused, showing Richard Lawson standing beside Travis in what appeared to be a wooded area similar to the one behind the warehouse. Both of them alive, uninjured, and looking directly at the camera, as if aware the image would find its way to me. In that moment, I understood that the confrontation at the warehouse had not ended anything. It had merely interrupted a transaction, and whatever structure I had disrupted still considered the debt unresolved. After the letter arrived with the photograph of Richard Lawson standing beside Travis, as if the warehouse confrontation had been nothing more than a rehearsal, Megan and I reached a point where silence no longer felt like protection, but like complicity. In whatever instinct I once had to handle everything quietly through private channels dissolved under the realization that the structure we were facing extended beyond one corrupt attorney and one compromised sibling. We decided that if the system relied on anonymity and controlled narratives, then exposure was the only leverage we had left, and through a contact Megan found via a former classmate, we arranged a meeting with investigative journalist Laura Mitchell from Channel 8 News in Columbus, a reporter known for dismantling financial corruption stories that most outlets considered too complex or too dangerous to pursue. The first meeting took place in a neutral office space away from the station, and I laid everything out in methodical detail, from the anonymous claim process and the shell trust structures to the warehouse confrontation and the manipulated surveillance footage, while Megan filled in the timeline of her abduction and the robotic messages sent from her phone. Laura listened without interruption, her expression focused rather than sensational, occasionally asking for documentation, but never dismissing what sounded, even to my own ears, like the outline of a conspiracy thriller rather than a financial crime case. I handed over copies of my claim documents, redacted where necessary to avoid exposing the actual ticket serial number, and it was during that review that she paused over a name I had overlooked in my earlier stress. Beneath my alias and Richard Lawson's signature, listed in smaller print as a required oversight authority, was the name Benjamin Carter, identified as financial compliance auditor. I had skimmed past it initially because Lawson had framed the paperwork as standard procedural layering designed to ensure regulatory alignment. But Laura's brow tightened when she saw it, and she told us she would cross-reference the name through state employment and licensing databases. Within 24 hours, she called us back with a detail that chilled me more than the anonymous threats had, because Benjamin Carter did not officially exist in any active state record, not as a licensed auditor, not as a registered consultant, not even as a recently terminated employee. There were historical traces of the name attached to compliance filings several years earlier, but those entries have been archived and scrubbed from accessible databases in a way that suggested deliberate removal rather than routine expiration. As Laura's team dug deeper, patterns began to surface that recontextualized my win from isolated fortune to systemic mechanism. Over the past 5 years, there have been 4 other anonymous jackpot winners in Ohio whose identities were shielded through similar legal constructs. And in each case, the initial public announcement of an anonymous trust claim was followed by silence regarding the individual behind it. Laura tracked property records, business filings, and obituaries, and in every instance the person connected privately to those claims had effectively vanished from public life within a year of payout. No social media presence, no new business ventures, no visible relocation trail. None were officially reported missing, yet none left behind evidence of the lifestyle transformation such wealth typically produces. The Caldwell Health Advancement Grant, the foundation I believed I had created independently through layered legal entities, became another thread in the unraveling. Laura's researchers mapped its corporate registration back through intermediary holding companies and discovered that 7 shell corporations were indirectly linked to it through shared directors and overlapping filing addresses, some of which intersected with organizations that had previously handled anonymous lottery claims. The more the network diagram expanded on our office whiteboard, the clearer it became that what I thought was a personal deviation had merely intersected with a pre-existing lattice of controlled philanthropy designed to cycle funds through approved channels under the guise of charitable redistribution. My attempt to route money outside of those expected pathways had not simply been inconvenient. It had threatened a structured laundering architecture that relied on predictable anonymity and compliance oversight by figures like the non-existent Benjamin Carter. As the pieces aligned, the narrative shifted from my family's greed and Lawson's betrayal to something broader and more entrenched, and Laura prepared an expose that would outline not only my case, but the pattern of prior winners and the phantom auditor whose name appeared wherever anonymity intersected with large disbursements. The segment was scheduled to air in 3 days, pending final legal review, and for the first time since this began, I felt a cautious sense of agency returning. Not because I believed exposure would eliminate danger, but because it would disrupt secrecy, the oxygen that had allowed this system to function undetected. On the evening before the broadcast date was publicly confirmed, I stepped outside my townhouse to clear my head, the air cold and still, my thoughts cycling through worst-case scenarios and contingency plans. And when I returned inside, my phone vibrated with a notification from an encrypted messaging app that had previously delivered nothing but threats. I opened it and saw a live photo taken moments earlier of my car parked in its usual spot along the curb, the timestamp in the corner matching the present minute, the angle suggesting the photographer stood no more than 30 feet away. There was no caption this time, no demand or countdown, only the image itself, proof that, even as we prepared to expose them on public television, their surveillance had not faltered. I walked back to the window and parted the blinds slightly, scanning the street that looked deceptively ordinary under the glow of streetlights. Neighbors' houses quiet, no visible figure lingering near the sidewalk. The realization settled in with a familiar weight that the confrontation at the warehouse, the attempted coercion, the erased evidence, and now the expanding corporate web were not separate events, but coordinated layers of the same structure, and that by choosing to go public we had not stepped out of their reach, but directly into a larger arena. The system had been built on controlled anonymity and silent compliance. And now that we were preparing to disrupt that pattern, the message was clear without words attached. They were still watching, and they were close enough to prove it in real time. Before Laura finalized the broadcast schedule, she made a decision that likely prevented the entire story from being buried or discredited before it reached the public, as she alerted federal authorities with the documentation we had compiled, including my claim paperwork bearing the name Benjamin Carter, the corporate mapping of the shell charities, the timeline of the warehouse incident, and the pattern of prior anonymous winners who had effectively vanished from traceable public life. Within days, an FBI task force opened a formal investigation into the Ohio Lottery Commission and its associated compliance structures, and what had begun as my private nightmare transformed into subpoenas, sealed warrants, and coordinated interviews that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge or Columbus. Agents questioned me repeatedly, not as a suspect, but as a central witness, dissecting every signature, every transfer authorization draft Lawson had presented, every communication I had received, and although the process was invasive, it carried a legitimacy that no private confrontation could match. Laura's expose aired only after federal authorities confirmed active involvement, and when it did, the story detonated nationwide in a way I had not fully anticipated, dominating headlines with phrases like rigged payouts, shelled charities, phantom auditors, and missing winners. My name, once carefully shielded through anonymous trusts, became public by my own choice when I stepped in front of the camera and forfeited anonymity to explain how the system had attempted to coerce compliance and silence deviation. I described the warehouse, the timer, the erased footage, the letter that said "you still owe US," and the photograph of Lawson standing beside Travis after the failed coercion. And in doing so, I accepted that privacy would no longer be my refuge. Weeks into the investigation, news broke that Richard Lawson had been found dead in a Florida motel room, ruled an overdose by local authorities, and the official tone surrounding his death felt too neat, too contained, as if the most visible piece of the machinery had been removed before he could testify under oath. Travis turned himself in shortly afterward, claiming he had acted under coercion and financial desperation, painting himself as a manipulated intermediary rather than an architect, and although his testimony provided fragments of insight into the tracking and pressure tactics used against me, it left critical gaps where higher coordination should have been explained. Benjamin Carter, the name that had triggered the unraveling, disappeared entirely from traceable existence. No reemergence under alternate filings, no verified identity. Only the hollow imprint of a compliance auditor who had never truly existed within official systems. The investigation froze the majority of my winnings pending forensic accounting and asset tracing, placing trusts and disbursements under federal supervision to determine which portions had intersected with suspect routing pathways. On paper, I was a multimillionaire whose funds were largely inaccessible, but the irony of that status did not sting the way it might have before everything unfolded. After the warehouse, after Megan's abduction, after the realization that anonymity had been a corridor within a larger laundering design, the money itself felt secondary, almost abstract compared to the cost already paid in trust and safety. A year later, Megan and I live under new identities in Colorado, relocated through protective channels that were explained to us in cautious detail by federal agents who made no promises about permanence. The mountains outside our rented home rise with an indifference that I find both grounding and unsettling, their scale dwarfing the human networks that once manipulated state systems for profit. Megan finished nursing school despite everything. The Caldwell Health Advancement Grant dissolved during the investigation and reconstituted transparently under federal oversight. And when she walks into the hospital where she now works, she carries herself with the same quiet steadiness she had long before any of this began. The rope marks on her wrists faded months ago, but I still notice how she occasionally checks the parking lot before unlocking her car, a habit neither of us comments on. Publicly, the scandal reshaped oversight protocols and triggered resignations within the Ohio Lottery Commission, and task force updates occasionally surface in news cycles that treat the case as an example of systemic vulnerability exposed by one reluctant whistleblower. Yet beneath the official narratives, there remains a residual uncertainty that never fully resolves. Lawson's death closed one avenue of testimony. Travis's cooperation filled in only selective details, and Benjamin Carter remains a name without a body, a compliance auditor who signed documents that shifted millions without ever appearing in a courtroom. Last month, long after the media frenzy subsided and our new routine had begun to feel almost stable, a plain envelope arrived forwarded through layers of mail redirection that should have obscured our location. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a sentence printed in the same clean, unembellished font that had marked the earlier threats. It read, "You can outrun US." Beneath this sentence was a printed lottery number formatted exactly like an official drawing sequence. Yet when I checked every state and multi-state record accessible through public databases, the number matched no drawing in any jurisdiction. It was a sequence that existed only on that page, untethered to a legitimate jackpot, a phantom result implying a game still being played beyond visible systems. I stood in our Colorado kitchen holding that page while Megan watched my expression shift from confusion to recognition. And I understood that what haunts me is not the frozen accounts or the forfeited anonymity, but the possibility that the structure we exposed was only one visible layer of something designed to regenerate under new names and new compliance auditors. The money sits largely inaccessible, numbers on statements reviewed by investigators rather than spent, and I find that I do not resent that reality because the true cost was never financial. It was the erosion of certainty, the knowledge that surveillance can persist beyond prosecution, and the understanding that some systems do not collapse when exposed but adapt. The printed lottery number that matches no drawing rests in a locked drawer in our new home, a reminder that even in the quiet of the mountains, the game may not be over.